All right. Awesome. Okay, so we're live, and it looks like it's just us in here right now. That's fine. I can check it on YouTube to see the comments. Oh, joy. Okay. Let me see. Where are the comments at? We go. Oh, there's me. Oh, good. Okay. Mhm. All right, we're going to get started with this soon. I see that we are streaming to YouTube right now, and that's pretty awesome. Yeah, so I'm going to wait one more minute to see if anybody else shows up. Jade Sable says, hi. Hi, Jade. Hope you all are doing okay. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Joe Wu. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering at Lafayette College, and today I'm going to give a short talk about coffee. I'd like to thank the International Student Association for giving me this opportunity. So let's just give a brief overview of this. First, we're going to talk a little about the origins of coffee and where they come from, and then we'll talk a little about roasting, and then we'll move into extraction of different types of coffee and drinks. So let's start at the beginning. Coffee, as we know it, started in around 850 AD, as the stories go, where there was an Ethiopian goat shepherd by the name of Kalbi, who noticed that when his goats were eating the fruit from a very specific small bush, that they would be invigorated and they would move around, they would dance around with higher energy. And he found that when he would eat these fruits as well, that he would similarly become invigorated and empowered. And he then brought that coffee plant to a Sufi monastery in Yemen, which subsequently resulted in its spread to the rest of the Islamic world. While this is a very commonly told story, there is very little tangible evidence that shows that this story actually occurred. However, it is a pretty commonly spread tale. If you look a little bit more at the historical documents, we see that texts will describe coffee becoming a commodity trade good from the Yemeni region where this story seemed to have ended, out of the port city of Mocha. From there, it spread through trade routes around the Mediterranean Sea and through cultural spread of Turkish slaves who were taken in by European settlers, and they eventually found that coffee would be more spreadable to the rest of the world, the Western world. The following centuries, coffee houses similar to those that had begun to form in the Middle East became incredibly popular in Europe. You would see them all over Germany, Austria, France, Italy, and the like. There was some initial resistance from the Catholic Church. However, one Pope, Pope Clement VIII, allowed for its further spread, thus allowing its spread to continue to expand beyond that of what was originally occurring. In turn, these European settlers brought coffee seedlings to the Americas to accommodate the increasing demand that they were observing in their own countries. This, in turn, led to spread to Asia, where there were some colonies out of Europe, and there were also some smaller cultural developments of their own that had organically formed through trade routes through the Middle East directly. All of this is tantamount to say that over the last millennia or so, coffee started from one very niche region of Eastern Africa and is now traded all over the world. Coffee is now the 7th most traded agricultural commodity crop globally, and the 2nd most traded commodity exported by developing countries. We see in this chart over here that that Brazil is the leading exporter of coffee, and followed by Vietnam, which is in Asia. Looking at the different regions in which we are spreading, in which coffee is exported, rather, we see a large preference towards Central and South America, a little bit lesser in Africa, and a significant presence in Asia as well. In a more contemporary standpoint, we tend to discuss coffee with regards to a number of cultural waves. The first wave that we discuss is the first wave of coffee, which treated coffee as a highly industrialized commodity. So now that enough sufficient sourcing and production had been developed in Brazil and the rest of South America, larger companies such as Folgers, Chock-full of Nuts, etc., were exporting and producing to scale. And this led to the very homogeneous, very dark roasted type of coffee that we tend to think of in the early to mid 1900s. As time progressed, though, we started getting a little bit more, let's say, thoughtful in how we produced our coffee. A little bit more thought went into the sourcing and the origins of these coffee. You couldn't just take a bean from any old place and expect it to behave the same way. And there were a number of small boutiques that eventually grew to very large corporations in a very short period of time. The most well-known of this, obviously, is Starbucks. But your brands like Peet's Coffee also fall into these types of highly commoditized also, but still a little bit more mindfully considered than previous industrial applications. The third wave of coffee, which is what some consider where we are now, and some consider where we're on the tail end of, was the rise of the small batch craft, the rise of the community coffee roasters, the rise of the super micro lot coffees. And to that end, the priority shifted from creating coffee to scale and more focused on the actual art of the production of coffee. The conversation led to, where are these beans coming from? Which farm did they come from? What nuances can we draw based off of individual locations and individual processing? It became more about the art form of producing coffee rather than just getting product at the end. But as these things tend to operate in cycles, and much like how Starbucks started as a small company and got very large, some have argued that we are now entering a fourth wave of coffee, where we are taking these smaller organizations and they're starting to scale up. You have companies like La Colombe, which starts as a relatively small coffee roaster and is now producing canned coffees and that are distributed nationally and globally. And it's not an intrinsically better or worse situation. There's no good or bad guy in this whole development of how coffee has evolved as a field. It's just the kind of way that things have sort of worked out, where priorities have kind of shifted again towards growth and globalization as our world has become a little bit more connected than it was in previous decades. So that leads to the question, why do we like coffee so much anyway? Like, we produce all this coffee, why are we doing this? Now, some would argue it's the routine piece of it. It's easy to attain, it's easy to make. There's a certain ritualistic piece of it where every morning you wake up, you load your Mr. Coffee full of ground beans, and then you have your cup of coffee for the morning. There's a certain routine to having a coffee meeting with somebody, where if you're tired of working for a certain number of hours at your desk, that you can get up take a walk and find some purpose by going to a coffee location, getting a cup of coffee, and just enjoying the whole experience rather than just the cup. That being said, the content of the cup is somewhat important too. And the thing that usually springs to mind is caffeine. Now, caffeine is what is known as an adenosine receptor antagonist, which, in not so many words, will mask the sensation that you are feeling tired. It doesn't actually infuse you with energy per se, apart from giving you a brief boost of adrenaline in non-users, but it will mask the sensation of fatigue to a certain extent. And the final reason, which is ostensibly the reason why we like to work in a little bit in these more craft sort of senses, is the flavor of coffee. Coffee tends to play nicely with a lot of other flavors. You have your chocolates, which give you mochas, you have your vanilla macchiatos, you have your pumpkin spice lattes, which take over the world every year around August through November. And coffee will occasionally show up in baking applications. The third and fourth wave roasters will also use them in mixed alcoholic drinks, and etc. So coffee is really finding its way into every component of our lives. So if we're going to focus on the flavor, let's take a second and consider what makes coffee smell and taste good. And we can look at this wheel here, which is known as the this is the coffee taster's wheel produced by Counterculture Espresso out of North Carolina. And we see that there are a bunch of different flavor notes that one can experience out of coffee. We see floral notes, we see sweet and sugary notes, we see spice, we see nut, we see chocolate, we see tropical fruit. And all of these flavors can be attributed to specific flavor compounds, specific chemicals that might exist in your coffee. So, for instance, the flavor of lemon and lime can be attributed to a compound called limonene, which is a terpene that is produced by plants in pretty significant quantities. We can extract the flavor of apple through a compound called malic acid, which is a small to mid-weight organic acid. Some coffees will have a little bit more smoky notes if you roast them a little bit darker, and we'll get to that in a moment. And they'll start forming these aromatic rings due to these roasting. And you'll get compounds like vanillin or cinnamaldehyde, which will give you the flavors of vanilla and cinnamon, respectively. So it's not just that coffee is evoking these flavors and plays nice with these flavors. There are flavor compounds that we use to attribute to certain flavors that exist in coffee when we taste it. So how do we get these flavors to be produced in the quantities that we want it to be? Because if we took any combination of these things in the wrong amounts, one could imagine things that start tasting really bad, really, really fast. There's that joke where they say, oh, this coffee tastes like dirt. And there's a certain truth to that. If you over-extract, you will get certain compounds like geosmin, which will make it taste literally like dirt. And ideally, we want to prepare our coffee in such a way where we minimize those types of compounds. So let's go back to where coffee is produced globally. So we took a moment earlier and we said coffee spread all over the world from Eastern Africa. It originated in Ethiopia, but then made its way around the entire rest of the world and is now produced at scale in South America. Now, there is a region of the world known as the Coffee Belt, which is a kind of crescent-shaped scoop along this map around the tropical regions. It's a combination of altitude, soil quality, air quality, and temperature that will lead to successful cultivation of coffee. And so all over the world, we see different types of coffee. Looking a little bit deeper at this map, which was lovingly produced by Torch Coffee Roasters, we see that depending on where we grow our coffee, they will take on different characteristics. So the ones that we tend to think of in the US when we think of Colombian coffees or Brazilian coffees, will tend to have a medium body to it, a thickness or texture to it, a medium acidity to it, and a certain level of nuttiness that we would think of as somewhat approachable, or things that would tend to pair well with other things. Looking at regions in Africa, we see that we have flowery and herbal notes, which do not appear in South American coffees as much due to the inherent differences in the soil in which they're grown. They might have similar weather and similar growing conditions, but the fundamental location means that you're going to get different things going into the plants. The flavor profiles are going to be a little bit different. Some might consider them brighter. Some might consider them tasting more tea-like. Some people who are not familiar with it will kind of balk at this flavor profile and say, why is this coffee sour? And it's not that it's sour, it's just taking on a different profile of those characteristics that we were just discussing. Likewise, if we were to go to Asia and start making coffee out of, let's say, Papua New Guinea or Indonesia, we'll get stuff that's a little bit more earthy, as they described it. And so going a little bit too much into that land will give you something that tastes a little bit dirt-like or a little bit astringent in a way that, to the untrained palate, will be less than favorable. And then off in the region to the left over there, we have Hawaii, which has its own little microclimate due to it being a remote island with a volcano that gives it very unique characteristics. But all of these are tantamount to say that where you get your beans from will have a profound effect on what your coffee ultimately tastes like. Sure. So where you're starting will dictate what it becomes. Great. The other thing that we need to consider is the type of roasting that we put into coffee. So we don't just take a coffee plant, pull the little cherry thing off of it, take the seed out and eat it or drink it. No, what we do is we'll take these beans, we'll let them ferment for a bit, and then we'll extract them, and then we will roast them. Applying heat to these beans causes a profound change in the physical characteristics and the chemical composition of the stuff that we are ultimately able to extract from it. So on this figure over here, we see coffee in a bunch of different temperatures. And as it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, it will start to manifest different characteristics. As you initially heat it up, you'll get a bit of a drying. And then you'll start to brown it, much like browning a steak or the golden brown that forms on top of bread. Those are called Maillard reactions, and they are prominently featured in the formation of polymers between proteins and sugars. We'll also get caramelization reactions, which are the breakdown of sugar and starch compounds into larger molecules as well. And then once you go beyond that, you'll start to get into this thermal decomposition phase, where you start breaking down compounds into more aromatic type compounds. They will be on the precipice of bordering between things like chocolate and vanilla into things like smoke and ultimately charring. So you run into a little bit of a balancing act as you go along there. So sure. But that's all just pictures, right? How do we actually know what this looks like, and how do we get to these different types of roasts? Well, what we can do is we can actually do an example of a roast. So what I have for you guys today is a drum roaster that Lafayette College has been happy to use. And here it is over here. So a drum roaster, much as its name implies, is kind of like a barrel turned sideways with some baffles in it that lets it spin around. And if you can imagine, on the outside of this thing, there are heating elements that are kind of like toasters. So this whole thing is an oven that has a spinning drum in the middle of it that is heated uniformly. So what we're going to do is we're going to take some green beans, which look kind of like this. And we're going to just drop them into this roaster over here. But wait, how do we know what the roaster actually is going to be doing? Like, how do we know what its temperature is going to be? Well, we can actually monitor this fairly well by using technology. It's a glib way of putting it, but ultimately that's all we're really doing. We're just going to take a measurement. And so what I'm sharing with you now is a temperature readout of the inside of this drum. So what you should be able to see in the little widget on the bottom is this drum roaster still spinning? And then you'll be able to see the temperature of our widget over here. So that's fantastic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to up the heat a little bit, and then we're going to drop the coffee in right now. What we see right now is that the external temperature, ET, is about 200 degrees Celsius. And that's a little bit low, but that's around the threshold of where we want to be for the roasting of coffee. So we're starting with relatively green coffee, well, green coffee to be more precise, and then we just drop the coffee in. So if I just dump it in, we should now see a sudden drop of the temperature. Now our coffee roaster has recognized that there are coffee beans in there, because as soon as we put room temperature coffee beans in there, the temperature drops, because the oven that was hot now has something that is cold by comparison inside there. And so the temperature will plunge ever so slightly. And by ever so slightly, I mean it's going to drop quite a bit. What we are looking to see is that eventually the beans will heat up to the point where they will start increasing in temperature alongside the roaster itself. So right now, what we see is the temperature of the oven close to the beans, which is dropping and now leveling off. As we are doing this, we are imparting heat into these beans. We're increasing their temperature. So not a whole lot has really happened compositionally yet. It's just heating up. And now we have gotten to what is known as the turning point, where we are now getting significant dehydration. So both the oven and the beans are starting to heat up. And what we are hoping to get to is a nice medium roast. So in the camera over there, you'll see that the beans are still pretty much the same looking. Not a whole lot has happened so far. That's because dehydration unto itself is not particularly interesting. It's just pulling moisture out. No reactions have actually occurred yet. But over the next couple of minutes, we are going to get to the point where we're going to observe some significant changes. All right, so while we're waiting this thing to heat up, let's take a quick look at the comments. Hello, everybody. Hello. This Dow roaster certainly does make really pop. Hey, so one should not discount the usage of home-brewed coffee roasters. Like, those are really cool. You take an Arduino board, a couple of popcorn heaters, and you just go to town. Good stuff. All right, so what we see is that this blue line over here denotes how fast the temperature is changing. And we might notice that we are running into a little bit of an issue in that the temperature is starting to level out a little bit. And that can be due to a number of different reasons. It could be that there's a slight breeze around the roaster, which there is, because we like to make sure that we don't burn down everything. We also noticed that the roaster itself is starting to drop in temperature a little bit, and so as it gets closer in temperature, the exchange rate between the two temperatures will start to become a little bit less efficient, and so we need to up the temperatures a little bit. Okay, so a question says, at what point does a bean produce oil? So what you are describing is something that happens towards the end of a roast. So what you might see in Italian and French roast is that the beans are not only really, really dark, they're also super shiny. And that's as they heat up to very high temperatures, you will start to not only extract oils, they will start to polymerize with each other. And then you will wind up with you will wind up with this sheen. This happens at around 200 Celsius and will continue beyond as it gets darker and darker. So ballpark around there. Okay, so we are hovering a little more. That's okay. So let's take a look at some of the beans that we have in there. If we were to pop one or two of these out, if we extract one of the beans out of there, we can take a look at this, and we might see something like this. Oops, there we go. So it's starting to yellow a little bit, and we're just going to give it a little bit of time. Alrighty. So just a little bit more, and we're good to go. Where we're going now with this is that once it gets into the high 160s in Celsius, we will start approaching what is known as the first crack. This is where we get a reaction not too dissimilar from that of popcorn, where in addition to having these roasting reactions, these Maillard reactions, these caramelization reactions, we also start to liberate some water in there, and it starts to puff up a little bit. It makes an audible sound, hence its term, the first crack. Yeah. So with these roasters, there exists a couple of different types of coffee roasters. What we have here, what we're working with, is a very common form. It'll be very similar to the ones that you will see in most third wave or small batch roasters. They will be significantly larger and operate on largely the same principles. It just needs to have uniform mixing, a controllable heat source, and readout that you can use to inform your decision making in the amount of heat that you deliver. If you go to yet larger scale, like Starbucks, they also tend to use these types of production. In New York City, at the flagship Starbucks roaster, there is a gigantic drum roaster that is roughly the size of let's say a small water tower that can facilitate high production of beans using largely the same principles. The average coffee roast takes anywhere between 7 and 10 minutes to produce for a very small batch, like what we're working with right here, to about 20 minutes if you're working with a more sizable roaster. This type of roaster that we are working with here is also known as a sample roaster, for the very specific reason that it works in very small quantities and you can turn around these results in relatively short order. All right, so another question says, recently got a bag from a very small roaster that says they roast the first crack and it came out somewhat oily. Are they lying, or is it still possible to get oil at the first crack? So the way that you can extract oil out prematurely is if the heating element of your roaster is too hot. So what will happen is that much like how you will get a very different result if you sear a steak with a ripping hot surface compared to if you baked it. You get very different temperature profiles inside of your steak. So too can you do that with coffee. If your roaster is too hot, what will happen is that the temperature of the outside of your bean will elevate to the point where it's going to give up a lot and start charring before the inside is properly roasted. So while the overall temperature might wind up being around the nominal first crack temperature, you might still wind up with conditions that will look like a mixture between unroasted coffee and over-roasted coffee. So that's usually what happens there. Yeah, and this is something that you would have to get used to depending on what your roaster does. Every roaster will behave differently depending on where its heating elements are, how responsive it is with respect to time. If you are overheating, how fast can it back off once you tell it to stop heating? And all of those will have factors in what your ultimate product will be. As you get a little bit more practice in how your beans handle and how your roaster handles, you'll hopefully be able to get a combination that works to your liking. Okay, so we are now entering the first crack region where we hear a distinct pop coming from the inside of the roaster. And that's good. That's what we like to hear. This is happening about 178 Celsius. And depending on how fast we would like to heat this, we would back off on the heat so that we could let these flavors kind of develop. Because this particular specific batch is heated up relatively slowly, we don't need to adjust any of the conditions on our roaster right now. Question, what's my favorite third wave roaster? My favorite third wave roaster is Counterculture Coffee out of North Carolina. I think that there's a lot of really good stuff that goes on. I think Counterculture is starting to get a little bit larger in scale and production, so they don't quite have the same kind of mindfulness as Super Duper Small Batch. Or rather, more accurately, that their priorities are shifted to slightly different things. More recently, I had coffee from a roaster called Elixir out of Philadelphia. They were very good, and I would highly recommend that. What is the best roast, in my opinion? I think that it really depends on what you're going for. I think that if you want to have I would say that a good all-purpose one will be a medium roast, somewhere around what's known as a city roast. I'm not super a big fan of Italian and French roasts, which are on the darker side, but there is some value to them. The lighter roasts are also quite good to have as drip coffee, but they tend to lose quite a bit of their flavor when you put them in, say, espresso drinks. Glitch Coffee Roasters out of Tokyo. I have not heard of them, and I will be happy to give them a shot. They sound pretty interesting. All right, so we now see that we are approaching 193 Celsius. And so what you'll see now is that the nominal bean temperature is now getting higher than that of the roaster temperature itself. And that is because the chemical reactions that are taking place right now inside of the beans are now producing heat themselves as well. So in addition to being heated by the roaster, it's also heating itself through chemical reactions. And it's around there where I personally like to call it a day with respect to beans. Around 200 is where I would say it's good enough. And so it is at this point where I say drop. And now I can stop sharing this and we can take a look at the beans. So the beans just drop down into this little spinny hopper down the bottom. And what it's doing now is it's cooling it down. There's a little fan on the bottom of it and a little mixer that is causing it to try to stop the roasting process from proceeding any further. So we're going to give that a hot second to cool down a little bit, because ideally we would like to make some coffee from these in a moment. So, okay, we say, Vincenzo Olivet says, I lived in Durham last summer, went to a couple of Counterculture's education events. They're awesome. Yes, they are really cool. So most third wave roasters will have some public outreach events and education to the general public. That's actually part of how I learned about coffee originally. When I first started learning about coffee in graduate school, I decided to just go to as many different coffee places in New York City as I possibly could. And I just picked up incidental knowledge from the baristas and roasters that happen to be working there. And so the educational events that they've started to have, much like the barista school from Joe Coffee in New York and Philly, all very, very educational, all very, very helpful. If you want to hear a true professional talk about this stuff, I cannot recommend highly enough that you go to one of these guys. Okay, so let's take a second and compare some of these roasted beans to some of the unroasted beans. What we see is that if you were to pull one of these roasted beans and put it right next to an unroasted bean, that the roasted coffee bean is pretty much the exact size and shape that we would come to expect from a coffee bean, and the green one is much smaller. And that kind of speaks to the puffness that we would expect in the first crack. So these kind of puffed up a little bit. And it's unfortunate there's no such thing as smell-o-vision, as they say, because it smells amazing in here right now. All right, so with that, I think that I can now cut the temperature on the roaster. Good. Okay. So that's enough of looking at a spinny roaster thing. Come back to here. All right, so we've now roasted 100 grams of we roasted 100 grams of coffee that came from Papua New Guinea. So this is an Asian coffee, and what we're going to do is we're going to get into the next part of this talk, which is what exactly we do once we have our coffee produced, or we have our coffee in hand. Go back to where we were. It was not a smooth transition. All righty, so let's talk about extractions of coffee. How do we, well, now that we have our beans, how do we extract the correct amount of flavor from our beans? And what we get is that getting desirable flavor profiles will depend on a couple of factors: the concentration of the coffee that you use, so the literal amount of beans that you put in, and the fraction of the flavors that exist within the beans that we're able to pull out at any given point in our process. Now, these aren't exactly interchangeable. You can't compensate for using a small amount of beans by extracting flavors out for a long period of time. You're going to get different stuff out of it. So getting 100% of the stuff of 5 grams of coffee versus getting 50% out of 10 grams of coffee will give you wildly different flavor profiles. And if you go too high or too low, you'll wind up with what are called strong or weak cups of coffee, depending on literal strength, versus bitter and underdeveloped cups of coffee, depending on if you've drawn too much out of the beans that exist. So how do we change what we can extract? There's a couple of different ways. One is by working with grind size. So when you grind coffee, you can adjust how fine the coffee is ground to. And in general, larger grinds of coffee are slower to disperse what they contain because there is slightly less surface area compared to finer coffee. You can change the brew temperature and pressure in that when you increase the pressure that you're extracting coffee, you're going to open up the range of compounds that you're able to pull out in your given process of extraction. If you work at a higher temperature, the rate in which you pull out flavor compounds is going to be accelerated to a degree. And it's not going to be uniformly accelerated from different compounds. So if you adjust the temperature to a specific way, to a specific value, you can actually pull out different compounds selectively. This is actually the inherent mechanic behind cold brew coffee, where you're pulling out certain compounds very, very slowly, knowing that it takes a long time to get those. If you do it incorrectly, though, you wind up with incredibly bitter or incredibly acidic tasting coffee. Those compounds tend to be either high in concentration for bitter compounds or high in solubility with acidic compounds. And so if you put junky beans into water and let it sit for a full overnight window, you might wind up with some really, really nasty tasting coffee. And longer brew times will allow for more of what can be dissolved to dissolve. And when it comes to the name of this talk, what constitutes the perfect cup of coffee? Really, you should work with these different variables and figure out what works best for your own personal taste. What I consider to be the best cup of coffee might be wildly different from what somebody else considers. And so now we're going to talk about different means of extraction. We're going to talk about, first, a pretty common one, the pour-over type of coffee. This is most similar to the kind of percolator type coffee machines that you might have been familiar with from the 70s and 80s. More popular now in coffee places, they will have this thing, which is known as a Chemex. And you take hot water, pour it over a filter filled with medium to coarse ground beans, and then you very, very slowly pour it on there through a paper filter, which blocks a lot of the fine solids and some of the oils in there, which results in what some have described as a cleaner cup. So let's show what that actually looks like. Okay, so 1 second. Alrighty, so now let's change this. Such grace. Okay, that is a odd camera angle. Okay. This over here is a Chemex. And what we're going to do is we're going to load this Chemex with some of the beans that we've just roasted. Now, as we described, we want to have an 18-to-1 ratio of water to coffee. And so the best way to do that is to actually use a scale and weigh it. So for the purposes of this demonstration here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to weigh out 20 grams of coffee. Now, I know that some people who are familiar with roasting coffee on their own might balk at the fact that I'm using coffee that I have just roasted to start using them, or rather to make a cup of coffee. What some people will tend to do is they will let their coffee settle out a little bit. They'll let it what is known as off gas. So, for example, one of the questions in comments right now says, "How many days post roast do you wait until you try your coffee?" I have found that depending on the source beans and how I am roasting it from batch to batch, that sometimes I'll get lucky and it'll work right away and give me something that I want. And then as it continues to off gas over the following couple of days, I'll get a slightly different flavor flavor profile. I will generally wait about maybe 2 to 3 days. If for no other reason that I will roast beans a couple days before I run out of beans. And in general practice, that has worked out pretty well for me. That being said, if you wanted to see how your coffee works right off the bat, there's really no inherent problem with just roasting them and then going with it. People who produce coffee on a larger scale will tend to shy away from that is because when you have a cup of coffee right out of the roaster, it will seldom be representative of what your customers actually have when you bring it to them or when you distribute it to your actual cafe. So unless you are a home roaster, you probably are better off waiting a couple of days to see what it tastes like. All right. So what I'm doing here is I have a grinder in this back over here. And I'm going to apply a medium grind to load onto my Pyrex. All right. So what we have here is we have our paper filter, we have our beans that are roasted, and what you will see right now is that this paper is kind of popping out right now. And what we would want to do in general, before you even put the coffee on here, is what some call priming the filter. What I'm doing right now is I'm just going to pour a little bit of hot water over this filter and let it pull out some of the flavors of the paper itself that might exist in there, as well as allowing the filter to kind of spread out and occupy the surface that it's ultimately going to take on. And once that is passed through, I will clear this out and take off the filter for a second, and I just dump it into the sink. And so now we have our filter that is primed with water and should be ready to go. So now I have our ground coffee. So if we take a look closely at this, we see that it is roughly the consistency of very, very coarse kosher salt. That's kind of where you want to be. As you get finer and finer, it's going to look kind of like table salt and ultimately a little bit dusty. And so, yeah, you adjust your grind as depending on the preparation. What we are going to do now is we load up our coffee into the filter. And then we apply some water in there. Now what we're going to do is, because we have loaded this with 20 grams of coffee, and we want an 18-to-1 ratio of water to coffee, we're aiming for 360 grams of water that we're going to be adding. So we balance this scale out to 0 before we apply the water. Now, rather than applying all 360 milliliters at once, what we're going to do is we're going to apply a small fraction of it first, about 50 milliliters first, to do what is known as letting the coffee bloom. So I put in a little bit more than that, about 62. And if you take a look at this, whoops, there we go. We see that there's some bubbling that's occurring there. So there's a combination of gases that were inside of the beans that are being let out. It's a combination of some of the aromatic compounds and carbon dioxide that were involved in the process of the roasting reactions. So we see that it is kind of puffed up a little bit. And from there, a bit shaky there, we apply a little bit more water. So now we've added a total of 200 grams. Let that go for a bit. And while I let that go for a bit, I will take a moment to check the comments. Nothing else has been added. Great. Okay. Then from here, we can start adding a little bit more water. You want this pour-over process to be quite slow. The whole process from start to finish should take about 3 to 4 minutes. So I now add the balance. So now we're at 362. Okay, fantastic. The water that you add, by the way, should not be at boiling. What the Specialty Coffee Association of America recommends is that you add water in the threshold of around 90 Celsius. This will prevent some of the more delicate flavor compounds that exist in coffee to not rip apart as soon as they are exposed to a sudden temperature shift. All right, so this is going to continue to filter out for a bit. Let us go back to the talk for a moment and continue what we were doing. All right, so what we've talked about is pour overs so far, and it's a slow, low pressure continuous process. Another common means of extraction is the French press, which takes very coarsely ground beans and puts it into a chamber or a little tank that we then fill up with hot water, let steep, and then extract out. Unlike a pour over, like the one that we have just worked with, a French press will have a metal mesh filter on the bottom of it, which allows for the passage of oils and very fine solids. This does what is known as increasing the body of your coffee, and it's a bit of a mixed bag depending on your own personal preferences on whether or not you'd like to have that in there. But this is how you kind of identify what you decide is the best cup of coffee. Okay, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to set this cup steeping. So again, we are working with a relatively high water to bean ratio. We want to weigh things out. This time we're working with a 15-to-1 ratio. And so I'm going to, if I put in 20 milliliters in there, 20 grams of coffee rather, I'm going to want to put in 300 milliliters of water. Now you'll notice that I'm putting it directly into the press itself. That is not how we're actually going to. That's not actually how we're going to serve this. What we're going, I was doing is just weigh it out, and we're going to put it into the roaster again. I've set the roaster to a much coarser setting, which will allow for a bit of a slower extraction because it has continuous exposure to the beans compared to the pour over, which had water passing through. You wind up with wanting to have some coffee that will be a little bit slower to extract. So we put it in there. We take a look inside. We can see that this coffee is a little bit more sand-like because it's coarser in consistency, which is cool. Okay. We got our 20 grams in there. Now we add, again, we put in some amount of water to let it bloom first. We let that swell up a little bit. We add more water. Okay, so take a minute, look at the comments. Looking forward to grabbing coffee on College Hill or in Easton in the future. What is my go-to coffee shop and what do I order? Okay, so there are a couple of good coffee places around College Hill. The ones that come to mind are Cosmic Cup, which is a long time institution of the College Hill area. It's run by a guy named Matt, and he is the roaster of a company called Monocacy Roasters, and they're pretty good. Down in a little bit downtown, there's a place called Fieldstone Roasters, which operate out of the Easton Public Market. They run a little bit of a darker roast, but they're also okay. There's Three Birds, which is also down the hill, and they are connected to a roaster. I believe they're called Passenger. They're relatively good as well. Question says, do I believe that agitating the bed helps with the blooming process? In general, yes. It is actually better practice for me to stir this. It was just I got distracted by answering questions, so my fault there. Talking about water packets. Have I ever used third wave water packets? So are you talking about? You might be talking about water softening, which is fairly common practice in regions that have relatively hard water, like New Jersey and Pennsylvania. I have noticed a tangible change since implementing water softening myself. I put it inside of my espresso machine. It works out pretty well. Yeah. So, yes, to reiterate, agitating the bed actually does significantly help with the blooming process. And we can see that once we do that, we actually get a much nicer response there. Yes. Okay. Alrighty, so let me just add this to the rest of this so that we are at 300. And I gotta keep a little bit closer on the time on this. All right, we are a little bit under the water there, so let me just a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to cap that, and we will get back to that in just a moment. Alrighty, so now the last piece that we will discuss is espresso. So espresso is what some people consider the least approachable of the coffee preparations, because it's the one that people tend to be least likely to produce in their homes. However, home espresso machines are becoming increasingly popular, increasingly cheaper, and therefore increasingly available. Some of them are entirely automatic, like the Nespresso machines that you'll see in most department stores, which will automate a lot of this process. However, it's working through the same general principle, where unlike the French press and the pour over, we're working at a significantly higher pressure, and we take our very finely packed bed of beans and we run water through it. It's a fast process, around 30 seconds, and as a result, we are able to put out an entirely different flavor profile compared to the other methods that we've discussed thus far. Much like the French press, the bottom part of the espresso portafilter, which is what the handle element there is called, is a metal plate with a bunch of holes in it, which allows for the passage of oils and very, very, very fine solids. In addition, because we are working at elevated pressures, and because we are working with something that allows oils to go through, we get this thing called a crema, which evolves very nicely on top. Okay, so first, we have now had enough time for this French press to sufficiently do its thing, so I'm going to press that real fast and then pour out the sample for demonstration purposes. Okay, and I'm just going to leave that on the side. Okay, so here we have our portafilter. Now, if you look inside, you can see that it looks almost like a continuous plate. However, there are some very, very tiny holes in there that you're going to use to drive water through. So as we established, we use a very fine grind here. So once again, we weigh out the amount of coffee we want to use, and we just load it in there. So we put this thing on there. Okay. Okay, so 20 grams, great. Put it in there. And then we load our portafilter. Okay, so we pull this out, and we now see that we have a little pile of grounds right on top of it that we would like to smooth out a bit. So most baristas you will see will kind of level out the beans on top here. And what we're going to do is we're going to tamp it down. So we have this metal tamp that we're going to press down onto. We're going to press down onto our spittle bed. We apply a normal force, and you'll hear things that say apply about 30 pounds of pressure straight down into the bed. And so you wind up with something that looks kind of like this, where you get a smooth bed on there. And then you can turn it over upside down and it stays in there, and there's no problem. So now we put it into the machine. So we've loaded it up, and we're going to put this directly into the shot glass. So once again, we have a 1.5 to 1 ratio of weight. So while we have 20 grams of coffee, the final espresso should end up at around 30 grams. Once again, like any of the other preparations, feel free to adjust any of these numbers to your own preferences. Playing around with it is really the best way. So we just hit go on this. What's going to happen here is that there's going to be a bit of a pressure buildup, and then it will start delivering espresso for you there. Right on. Okay. Put this back over here. And just dispose of this. Okay. So now that we've compared 3 different methods of coffee preparation, let's take a second to compare what they actually look like. I realize we're a little bit over, so I'll try to wrap this up soon. Okay. So we have our 3 preparations of coffee here. From left to right, this is our Chemex. This is our French press. And this one is our espresso. You'll notice the espresso has this layer of kind of a light brown foam on top of it. This is called the crema. And these are flavor compounds that would not really have been extractable via the other 2 methods. You'll also notice that between the French press on the right and the Chemex on the left, that there's a little bit more foaming on the right side. And that has to do with a little bit of the increased presence of oils and other surfactant species that might still exist within the coffee due to not having passed through the filter paper. So these are 3 different types of preparations of coffee. Now, which one is the best? Again, this will all be entirely up to personal preference. So looking at this, we're now back to up to here. And so let's wrap this up. We've now looked at 3 different types of coffee. They yield very different flavor compounds. They yield very different consistencies. They yield very different experiences. Yeah, that's the word. And ultimately, it is up to you as the individual to decide which is the best way to do this. Now, we spent the last hour and change talking about all the different things you can do to adjust this. You can adjust the roast. You can adjust the origin of the coffee. You can adjust the types of preparation that you'll get there. And all of them will yield slightly different experiences. What you'll find from espressos is that they will tend to be a little bit what some would consider like more harsh or bitter, because you're pulling out a lot of compounds that would take a long time to come out of the coffee in atmospheric pressure methods. But those flavor complements also tend to pair well with things like steamed milk. And so as a result, your drinks like your lattes or your cappuccinos will be improved for it compared to if you worked with just something like cafe au lait. Okay, so that is pretty much all I have for this talk. I'm happy to answer questions for the next couple minutes. One question that came up, what grinder do I have? It sounds so nice. Oh, that's very kind. So I have a Breville Smart Grinder. It is a burr grinder. A burr grinder is very similar to let me just pop the camera back to me for a second. Right, so you're not just looking at nothing. Mm-hmm. All right. So the difference between different types of grinders, there are grinders called blade grinders, which are kind of like food processors, where you kind of have a pair of whirling blades in the middle of it that will grind up your beans into little itty bitty pieces. The problem with that tends to be that the size that you get from the grind will be inconsistent and will have a distribution rather than a uniformity. A burr grinder is more like a pepper mill, where you run it through a conical piece of ceramic and you get a very specific size of coffee ground depending on how far apart the cone is from the actual grinding element. And so that gives a much more uniform surface. However, they tend to be significantly more expensive. Okay, so let's see. Any other questions that I might have missed? Well, I guess not. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for this opportunity. I really appreciate being able to talk about coffee. I am fully aware that as a amateur coffee maker who has just been given a lot of opportunity to talk about things that I find particularly interesting, that there's a lot of opportunity to learn more outside of this one talk. So if you want to go deeper into the specific details of extraction or the details of roasting, and even a more experienced roasting experience besides the one that I showed in this talk today, I cannot express enough the amount of expertise that exists both on the internet in general, through Specialty Coffee Association and the materials that they provide, as well as individual coffee roasters, which tend to have quite a bit of very detailed information to allow the home user to experience their own product to the best of your ability. And much like what I have said, they tend to share the idea that while they will provide a couple different options for type of beans that exist, it's really up to you in terms of preparation to decide what is going to work out best. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for this opportunity again. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at wooj@lafayette.edu. So with that, thanks and take care.